The photograph lay face down on the mahogany desk, its edges curled with age and secrets. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, Detroit's skyline glittered like broken promises against the October sky. A woman's manicured fingers hesitated above the image, the last evidence of a truth that had already cost one life. Outside, brake lights dotted the highway in perfect trusting rows, their red glow reflecting off wet asphalt like scattered rubies. Or blood. The snow fell like forgotten prayers over Millbrook, Colorado, each flake catching the amber glow of streetlights before surrendering to the darkness below. Marcus Kane stood beneath the flickering sign of Kane's Auto Repair, his breath forming small clouds in the December air as he watched the last customer of the day drive away, taillights disappearing into the white veil that had settled over their mountain town. Inside the garage, the familiar scent of motor oil and metal shavings provided a comfort he'd grown to depend on. 3 years. 3 years since Sarah's funeral meant the accident that had torn his world in half and left him with Lucy, 9 years old now, too smart for her own good and carrying shadows in her eyes that no child should bear. The bell above the shop door chimed, and Marcus looked up to see Dr. James Chen stepping inside, snow dusting the shoulders of his dark coat. James had become more than just Lucy's therapist over the past year. He'd become something Marcus hadn't expected to find again, a friend. "Closing early tonight?" James asked, pulling off his gloves and stuffing them into his coat pockets. Marcus wiped his hands on an oil-stained rag, the gesture automatic after 20 years of working with his hands. "Lucy's got a school project due tomorrow. Something about family trees." He paused, the irony not lost on him. "Figured I'd help her figure out what branches we've got left." James nodded understanding, passing between them without words. It was one of the things Marcus appreciated about the doctor. He didn't push, didn't probe unless invited. "How's she been sleeping?" "Better. The nightmares are less frequent." Marcus turned back to the engine he'd been working on, a 2019 Ford Explorer, with a mysterious rattling sound that had been evading diagnosis for the better part of 2 days. "She asked me yesterday if her mom would be proud of her science fair project." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant hum of the space heater in the corner and the soft patter of snow against the windows. James moved closer, his trained eye taking in the tension Marcus carried in his shoulders, the way his hands stilled on the wrench. "What did you tell her?" "The truth, that Sarah would be over the moon." Marcus's voice caught slightly on his wife's name. Even after 3 years, it still felt like swallowing glass. "But sometimes I wonder if I'm doing right by her, James. Keeping her here in this town where everyone knows what happened, where they look at us with those careful, pitying eyes." James settled onto a nearby stool, his presence steady and unhurried. At 43, he'd seen enough trauma in his practice to know that healing wasn't linear, that grief had its own timeline that couldn't be rushed or reasoned with. "Lucy's roots are here, Marcus. Her memories of her mother, your history with Sarah. Sometimes staying is the braver choice." Before Marcus could respond, the shop door opened again, bringing with it a gust of cold air and the soft sound of footsteps. Both men turned to see a woman standing in the doorway, snowflakes melting in her dark hair, her hands tucked deep into the pockets of a worn wool coat. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice carrying a slight tremor, whether from cold or nervousness Marcus couldn't tell. "I didn't realize you were closed. Mrs. Murphy told me you might be able to look at my car." Marcus studied her face in the garage's fluorescent lighting. She was perhaps 30, with sharp green eyes and the kind of bone structure that suggested good breeding, though she'd clearly tried to downplay it. Her clothes were simple jeans, boots that had seen actual use, a coat that looked like it had come from a department store rather than a designer boutique. But there was something in the way she held herself, a carefully controlled posture that spoke of years of training. "Rose Murphy's a good friend," Marcus said, setting down his wrench. "What seems to be the problem?" The woman stepped further into the garage, and Marcus noticed the way her gaze swept the space, taking in details with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to assessing situations quickly. "It's making a grinding noise when I brake. I'm not really car savvy, but it doesn't sound healthy." James watched the interaction with professional interest, noting the micro-expressions that flitted across the woman's face, a slight tightening around her eyes when Marcus moved closer, the way her breathing seemed carefully controlled. Signs of someone carrying stress, possibly trauma. In his years of practice, he'd learned to read people like others read books. "I'm Emma," she said, extending a hand toward Marcus. "Emma Novak. I'm Rose's granddaughter, sort of." Marcus shook her hand, noting the softness of her palm, not the hands of someone who worked outside despite the practical clothes. "Marcus Kane. This is Dr. Chen." Emma's attention shifted to James, and he caught something in her expression, a flicker of recognition perhaps, or wariness. "Doctor, psychologist," James clarified with a gentle smile. "I work with families here in town. Nothing to worry about." The way Emma's shoulders relaxed slightly didn't escape James's notice. "Interesting. Let me take a look at your car," Marcus said, reaching for his coat. "Where are you parked?" Emma led them outside to a burgundy Honda Civic, perhaps 10 years old, with Colorado plates and a few small dents that suggested it had seen its share of mountain driving. As Marcus popped the hood, James found himself studying Emma more closely. There was something about her that didn't quite fit the way she'd said, sort of, about being Rose's granddaughter, the careful distance she maintained, the quality of her boots that suggested they'd cost more than most people in Millbrook made in a month. "How long have you been staying with Rose?" James asked conversationally as Marcus examined the brake pads. "A few weeks," Emma replied, her answer coming just a beat too quickly. "I needed a change of scenery." Rose offered her spare room. Marcus straightened up, wiping his hands. "You're going to need new brake pads, probably rotors too. I can have the parts tomorrow, get you fixed up by afternoon." "How much?" Emma asked, and James caught the slight tension in her voice, not concern about affording it, but the careful tone of someone unused to asking about prices. "Couple hundred, depending on what we find when I get in there." Marcus's tone was matter-of-fact kind. "Rose is good people. I'll make sure you get a fair deal." Emma nodded, relief flickering across her features. "Thank you, both of you. It's nice to meet people who don't want anything from you, you know." The comment hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that none of them quite knew how to unpack. James filed it away, another piece of the puzzle that was Emma Novak. As they made arrangements for the car repair, the snow continued to fall, blanketing Millbrook, in the kind of pristine white that made the world feel hushed and separate from the chaos beyond its borders. None of them could have known that this simple encounter, a woman with car trouble, a mechanic willing to help a doctor with a gift for reading people, would become the first thread in a tapestry that would unravel everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. The Kane house sat on Elm Street, a modest two-story with blue shutters and a wraparound porch that Sarah had always talked about filling with flowers come spring. Now, 3 winters later, the porch held only a single rocking chair and Lucy's forgotten bicycle, both dusted with snow and waiting for a warmth that felt impossibly distant. Marcus found Lucy at the kitchen table, surrounded by poster board colored markers and a stack of photographs that chronicled the Kane family history in careful chronological order. She looked up as he entered, her dark hair so much like Sarah's falling into her eyes. "I can't figure out how to make the tree look right," she said, frustration evident in her young voice. "Mrs. Henderson wants us to go back at least 3 generations, but Mom's side just stops." Marcus settled into the chair beside her, looking at the photos spread across the table. Sarah's parents had died when she was young, a car accident when she was 16 that had left her an orphan, bouncing between foster homes until she'd aged out of the system. It was one of the things that had drawn them together in high school, both of them understanding what it meant to be alone in the world. "We work with what we have, kiddo," Marcus said gently, picking up a photo of Sarah from their wedding day. She'd been radiant, laughing at something off camera, her head thrown back in pure joy. "Mom always said family isn't just about who you're related to, it's about who shows up for you." Lucy nodded solemnly, then picked up a green marker and began drawing leaves on the branch that bore Sarah's name. "Dr. Chen says that too. That family can be chosen." The mention of James made Marcus smile. Lucy had been resistant to therapy at first, but James had a gift for making even the most difficult conversations feel safe. "What else does Dr. Chen say?" "That it's okay to miss Mom and still be happy sometimes." Lucy's voice was matter-of-fact, but Marcus could hear the weight behind the words. "And that healing doesn't mean forgetting." Marcus felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. This was progress, real measurable progress. For the first year after Sarah's death, Lucy had barely spoken about her mother at all, as if mentioning her might make the loss more real. Now at 9, she was learning to carry her grief like a stone she could set down when she needed to rest. "Tell me about this Emma person," Lucy said, suddenly switching to a red marker. Mrs. Murphy was telling everyone at the grocery store that her granddaughter was visiting. Marcus paused, thinking about the woman he'd met at the garage. "She seems nice. Quiet. Her car needs some work." "Is she pretty?" The question caught Marcus off guard, and he looked at his daughter with raised eyebrows. "That's an interesting question coming from you." Lucy shrugged, not looking up from her project. "Mrs. Henderson says that when people ask about whether someone is pretty, they're really asking if you like them." From the mouths of babes. Marcus considered this, thinking about Emma Novak's green eyes and the careful way she'd moved through his garage like someone unused to being in functional, unpretentious spaces. "I think she's complicated." "Mom was complicated too," Lucy said matter-of-factly. "You told me that once, that she had sad parts and happy parts and you loved all of them." Marcus felt his throat tighten. He'd forgotten that conversation had from one of Lucy's harder nights, when she'd asked why her mother had been crying so much in the months before the accident. Sarah's postpartum depression had been severe, and while Marcus had thought they were managing it, he sometimes wondered if he'd missed signs, if he could have done more. "Yes," he said quietly, "I loved all of her parts." Lucy nodded and continued working on her family tree, adding small details with the focused concentration that reminded Marcus so much of Sarah. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the scratch of markers on paper and the soft hum of the heater. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and somewhere across town, Emma Novak sat in Rose Murphy's spare bedroom, staring at a laptop screen filled with news articles that bore a name she'd spent months trying to escape. Elena Sterling, CEO of Sterling Automotive, presumed dead in a plane crash 6 months ago. The official investigation was ongoing, but the business world had already moved on, dividing up her empire like vultures picking over bones. Emma closed the laptop and moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered streets of Millbrook. For the first time in months, she'd made it through an entire day without thinking about board meetings or stock prices or the weight of a legacy she'd never asked for. Instead, she'd thought about brake pads and the kind eyes of a mechanic who'd treated her like just another customer, and the gentle probing of a psychologist who'd seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed facade. Tomorrow she'd pick up her car and probably find some excuse to linger to extend her stay in this town where nobody knew Elena Sterling's name or cared about automotive empires. For now, that felt like enough. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of mountain sunshine that turned fresh snow into fields of diamonds. Marcus arrived at the garage early, as was his habit, and found James already waiting by the door with 2 cups of coffee from the diner down the street. "Thought you might need this," James said, handing over one of the steaming cups. "Jenny mentioned you ordered the brake parts express delivery." Marcus accepted the coffee gratefully, fishing his keys from his pocket. "Emma said she needed the car back today. Seemed important." They settled into the familiar rhythm of the garage, Marcus working on Emma's Civic while James sat nearby, ostensibly reading case files, but actually providing the kind of steady companionship that had become invaluable to Marcus over the past year. It was James who'd suggested that Marcus might benefit from having someone to talk to about more than just carburetors and transmission fluid. "How long have you known Rose Murphy?" James asked, looking up from his paperwork. "All my life. She taught 3rd grade when I was a kid, retired about 15 years ago. Never married, no children of her own." Marcus paused in his work, considering. "I don't remember her ever mentioning a granddaughter." James made a non-committal sound, but Marcus caught the interested look that crossed his face. "What are you thinking, Doc?" "Probably nothing. Just professional curiosity." Before Marcus could probe further, the garage door opened and Emma stepped inside, bringing with her the crisp scent of winter air and something else, a subtle perfume that spoke of expensive taste carefully disguised. She wore the same practical clothes as the day before, but in the morning light, Marcus could see details he'd missed: the perfect cut of her jeans, the quality of her sweater, the fact that her simple earrings were actually small diamonds. "Good morning," she said, her gaze moving between Marcus and James. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Just finishing up," Marcus replied, wiping his hands on a rag. "New brake pads and rotors. Should stop like new now. How much do I owe you? Marcus named a figure that was fair but modest and watched as Emma reached into her purse, a worn leather bag that, like everything else about her, suggested money that was trying not to look like money. She pulled out cash, counting out bills with the careful precision of someone who'd been taught to always pay debts immediately. Keep the change, she said, handing him an amount that included a tip generous enough to make Marcus uncomfortable. That's too much. Please. The word came out sharper than she'd intended, and Emma visibly collected herself. I appreciate good work and kindness. James watched this exchange with growing interest, noting the way Emma's hands trembled slightly as she put her wallet away, the quick flash of something panic guilt that crossed her face when Marcus protested the tip. Emma, James said gently, are you planning to stay in Millbrook long? She looked at him directly for the first time, and James felt the full weight of whatever she was carrying. In her green eyes, he saw the kind of exhaustion that came from running too long from something too large to escape. I don't know, she said honestly. I haven't had a plan in a long time. Marcus found himself stepping closer, drawn by something in her voice that reminded him of Sarah during her darkest periods, the sound of someone drowning in plain sight. If you need anything while you're here, just ask. Millbrook takes care of its own. The kindness in his words seemed to undo something in Emma's carefully maintained composure. Her eyes filled with tears, she quickly blinked away, and she nodded without trusting herself to speak. Thank you, she managed finally. Both of you, for everything. She left quickly after that, her footsteps crunching through the snow as she made her way back toward Rose Murphy's house. Marcus and James watched her go, both men thinking their own thoughts about the woman who'd appeared in their quiet town like a secret that didn't know how to keep itself. She's running from something, James said finally. Marcus nodded. Question is what? Neither of them could have guessed that the answer would rewrite everything they thought they knew about love loss, and the weight of truths too heavy for one person to carry alone. That evening, Lucy Kane sat in Dr. Chen's office, her legs swinging from the too-tall chair as she worked on what James called her feeling journal, a notebook where she drew pictures that represented her emotions when words felt too small or too scary. Today's picture showed a house with smoke coming from the chimney stick figures of her and her father in the window, and a third figure standing outside in the snow. The outside figure had long hair and a question mark where her face should be. Tell me about this one, James said, settling into his own chair across from her. That's the lady who came to Daddy's shop, Lucy explained, adding careful details to the smoke. Emma, she seems sad, but like, good sad, like how I feel when I look at pictures of Mom. James leaned forward, slightly intrigued by Lucy's observation. Children often saw things that adults missed, their emotional intuition unclouded by the complications of grown-up logic. Good sad, like when you miss something that was really important to you. Lucy switched to a blue crayon, adding tears to the figure outside the house. She looked at Daddy the way I look at Mom's pictures sometimes. Like she was trying to remember something happy, but it hurt too much. The insight took James's breath away. In her simple 9-year-old way, Lucy had identified something he had only begun to sense, that Emma Novak carried the specific kind of grief that came from loving someone you'd lost. Do you think she should come inside the house? James asked, gesturing to the drawing. Lucy considered this seriously, tilting her head as she studied her artwork. I think she wants to, but maybe she doesn't know how to knock on the door. James made a note in his pad, thinking about Marcus and the careful way he'd watched Emma leave that morning. His friend was healing slowly but surely from the trauma of losing Sarah. But healing didn't mean the capacity for new love had died with his wife. It meant learning to carry grief and hope in the same heart. What would you tell her if you could? James asked. Lucy picked up a yellow crayon and began drawing a path from the figure to the front door of the house. I'd tell her that sometimes the door is unlocked even when it looks closed. And that being sad doesn't mean you can't have happy things too. In his years of practice, James had learned that children were often the wisest teachers when it came to the simple truths of emotional survival. Lucy Kane at 9 years old understood something about healing that most adults spent decades trying to learn, that opening your heart again wasn't about forgetting what you'd lost, but about making room for new love alongside the old. As their session ended and Lucy gathered her things, James found himself thinking about Emma Novak's green eyes. and the way she'd looked at Marcus like someone seeing sunlight after a long winter underground. Whatever secret she was carrying, whatever had brought her to Millbrook, James suspected that Lucy's instinct was right. Sometimes the door was unlocked even when it looked closed, and sometimes the people who needed sanctuary most were the ones too afraid to knock. The Millbrook Public Library was a small brick building that sat on Main Street between the hardware store and the coffee shop, its windows glowing warmly against the December afternoon. Lucy Kane pushed through the heavy doors, her backpack full of books about family trees and genealogy projects, her mind still turning over the conversation she'd had with Dr. Chen. The librarian, Mrs. Patterson, smiled as Lucy approached the main desk. "Back again, sweetheart. You're becoming quite the researcher." "I'm working on my family tree project," Lucy explained, setting her backpack down carefully. "But I want to look up something else, too." Mrs. Patterson raised an eyebrow. "Oh, what's that?" Lucy glanced around the library, making sure they were alone, before leaning closer to the desk. "There's a lady staying with Mrs. Murphy, Emma Novak. I want to see if she's famous or something." The request surprised Mrs. Patterson, but she'd learned over the years that children's curiosity often led to the most interesting research projects. "What makes you think she might be famous?" "She acts like people should know who she is, but she doesn't want them to," Lucy said with the matter-of-fact wisdom that sometimes startled adults. "Like she's pretending to be normal." Mrs. Patterson led Lucy to one of the public computers and helped her navigate to the search engine. "What do you want to look up?" "Emma Novak," Lucy said, watching as Mrs. Patterson typed the name into the search bar. The results that appeared made both of them pause. The first several hits were for Elena Sterling, CEO of Sterling Automotive, but the photos that accompanied the articles made Lucy's breath catch in her throat. "That's her," Lucy whispered, pointing at the screen. "But it says her name is Elena, not Emma." Mrs. Patterson clicked on one of the news articles, her expression growing more concerned as she read. The headline was, "Stark, Sterling Automotive CEO Missing Presumed Dead in Plane Crash." The article was dated 6 months ago, and the accompanying photo showed a woman in an expensive business suit, her hair perfectly styled, standing in front of a corporate logo that Lucy recognized from commercials. But the face was unmistakably the same woman who'd been at her father's garage. "Mrs. Patterson," Lucy said slowly, "if someone is supposed to be dead but they're not, is that bad?" The librarian looked at the 9-year-old beside her, seeing the wheels turning in Lucy's sharp mind. This was no longer a simple research project. This was a child stumbling onto something potentially serious. "Lucy, sweetie, sometimes people have reasons for wanting privacy," Mrs. Patterson said carefully, "reasons that might be important for their safety." Lucy nodded solemnly, understanding more than Mrs. Patterson might have expected. "Like how Daddy doesn't like to talk about the accident because it hurts too much." "Something like that." Mrs. Patterson closed the browser window and turned to face Lucy fully. "What are you thinking?" Lucy was quiet for a long moment, processing what she'd learned with the careful consideration that had developed in her since her mother's death. She'd learned that adults sometimes carried secrets that were too heavy for them, that kindness was more important than curiosity, and that some truths were gifts that had to be offered freely rather than taken. "I think," Lucy said finally, "that maybe Emma or Elena is like the birds that fly south for winter. Sometimes you have to go somewhere else to survive, even if people don't understand why." Mrs. Patterson felt a surge of admiration for this wise young girl who'd already learned lessons about compassion that some adults never mastered. "That's very insightful, Lucy." "I'm not going to tell anyone," Lucy continued, "but maybe I could be extra nice to her in case she's scared." The librarian nodded, helping Lucy gather her things. "I think that's exactly the right thing to do." As they walked toward the door, Lucy paused, looking back at the computer, where Elena Sterling's corporate headshot had been moments before. In that photo, the woman had looked confident, powerful, and touchable. But the Emma Novak she'd met at her father's garage had looked like someone who'd forgotten how to trust the world not to hurt her. Lucy Kane, at 9 years old, understood something that most adults missed. Sometimes the most important thing you could do for someone wasn't to solve their problems or uncover their secrets. Sometimes the most important thing was simply to see them as human and offer them a place to rest. And as she walked home through the snow-covered streets of Millbrook, Lucy found herself hoping that Emma, whatever her real name was, would decide to stay long enough to remember what it felt like to be safe. The truth, as Lucy was beginning to understand, was often less important than kindness. And kindness, unlike secrets, was something she had plenty of to share. The Sterling Automotive Memorial Service had been held on a gray October morning in Detroit 6 months before Emma Novak appeared in Millbrook. Elena Sterling's empty casket had been surrounded by white lilies and corporate executives who spoke in measured tones about legacy and leadership, their words carefully crafted to avoid any mention of the investigations that had been quietly launched in the weeks before her death. Emma had stood in the back of the funeral home watching them bury her sister's memory while the truth sat like acid in her throat. Elena had discovered something in the weeks before the plane crash, something about systematic cover-ups about vehicles released to market, with known safety defects, about a culture of silence that prioritized profit over human lives. The Pembroke Series sedan. Emma remembered the name because Elena had written it on a napkin during their last lunch together, her hands shaking as she explained what she'd found in the internal reports. "There's a brake system failure," Elena had whispered across the table at their usual restaurant in downtown Detroit. "It's happening in specific weather conditions, wet roads, temperatures below 40 degrees. The brake pad seize. Emma, they knew about it before the cars hit the market." Emma had listened with growing horror as her sister detailed the cover-up reports. Buried test results altered, whistleblowers silenced with NDAs and financial settlements. The Pembroke Series had been Sterling Automotive's flagship vehicle for 3 years, with over 200,000 units sold across the country. "I'm going to expose this," Elena had said, her green eyes so identical to Emma's own, blazing with determination. "I don't care if it destroys the company. People are dying because of our negligence." 2 weeks later, Elena's private jet had gone down in a storm over Lake Superior. The official investigation had found mechanical failure, but Emma knew better. Her sister had been carrying evidence documentation that would have brought down not just Sterling Automotive, but half a dozen other executives who'd been complicit in the cover-up. Emma had spent the first month after Elena's death paralyzed by grief and fear. The evidence Elena had gathered was now in Emma's possession, hidden in safety deposit boxes and encrypted files that only she could access. But using it meant stepping into the spotlight, becoming a target, risking the same fate that had befallen her sister. So she'd done what had felt like the only option. She'd disappeared. Now sitting in Rose Murphy's kitchen on a December morning in Millbrook, Emma stared at the local newspaper spread across the wooden table. The headlines were blissfully mundane. Snow removal schedule announced. High school basketball team advances to regionals. Library seeks volunteers for reading program. No mention of corporate conspiracies or missing CEOs. No photographers hiding in bushes or reporters asking probing questions about her whereabouts. Just the gentle rhythm of small-town life, where the biggest scandal might be whether the mayor was having an affair with the town treasurer. "You're up early," Rose said, shuffling into the kitchen in her worn robe and slippers. At 75, Rose Murphy moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had earned its aches through decades of teaching third graders and caring for others. "Couldn't sleep," Emma admitted, folding the newspaper and setting it aside. "Too quiet, I guess." Rose poured herself a cup of coffee from the pot. Emma had started settling into the chair across from her with a small sigh. "You'll get used to it. Millbrook quiet takes some adjusting to." There was something in Rose's tone that made Emma look up sharply. "What do you mean?" Rose studied her over the rim of her coffee cup, her faded blue eyes shrewd despite her advanced age. "Honey, I've been teaching children for 40 years. I know when someone's running from something." Emma's heart stuttered, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. "I don't know what you mean. Your car has Michigan plates, but you told Marcus you've been staying here for weeks. Your clothes are expensive, but you're trying to hide it. And yesterday when that news program came on the television, you left the room so fast you forgot your coffee." Rose's voice was gentle but firm. "I'm not going to pry, but I want you to know that you're safe here. Whatever you're running from, it doesn't have to follow you to Millbrook." Emma felt tears sting her eyes at the unexpected kindness. For 6 months, she'd been looking over her shoulder, jumping at shadows, never staying in one place long enough to feel secure. The idea that someone, this small elderly woman with gentle eyes and a teacher's instinct for protecting the vulnerable, was offering her sanctuary felt almost too good to be true. "I can't tell you everything," Emma said quietly. "But you're right, I am running from something. Someone, actually." Rose nodded, reaching across the table to pat Emma's hand. Then stay as long as you need to. My spare room hasn't had this much life in it in years. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the front door. Rose rose to answer it, and Emma heard the familiar sound of Marcus Kane's voice drifting from the entryway. Morning, Rose. Lucy forgot her science book here yesterday when she was visiting. Mrs. Henderson called to let me know. Of course let me get it, Rose replied, and Emma heard footsteps moving through the house. She should have stayed in the kitchen, should have let Marcus collect Lucy's book and leave without seeing her. But something drew her toward the front of the house, maybe the warmth in his voice, or the way he treated her with such uncomplicated kindness at the garage. Marcus was standing in Rose's small living room when Emma appeared in the doorway, and the smile that crossed his face when he saw her made something flutter in her chest. Emma, good morning. Good morning. She was acutely aware of her appearance, hair uncombed, wearing one of Rose's old robes over her pajamas, but Marcus's expression held only gentle warmth. I was just telling Rose that Lucy's been talking about you nonstop since yesterday, Marcus said, accepting the textbook Rose handed him. She's decided you need a proper welcome to Millbrook. Oh, Emma felt a mix of pleasure and anxiety at the thought of Lucy's attention. She wants to invite you to dinner tonight, Marcus continued, and Emma caught something in his tone that made her think this hadn't been entirely Lucy's idea. Nothing fancy, just spaghetti and whatever vegetables I can convince her to eat. Rose looked between them with undisguised interest, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. What a lovely idea. Emma hesitated, part of her wanting to accept, and part of her knowing that getting closer to Marcus and Lucy would only make it harder when she eventually had to leave. Because she would have to leave, there was no scenario where Emma Novak could stay in Millbrook forever without the truth eventually catching up with her. I don't want to impose, she said finally. You wouldn't be, Marcus replied, and the sincerity in his voice made Emma's chest tighten. Lucy could use more positive female influence in her life, and I could use the company of someone who doesn't spend all day asking me why her science project volcano won't erupt properly. Rose laughed at this, and Emma found herself smiling despite her reservations. In that case, I'd love to come. Great, 6 o'clock. We're on Elm Street, the blue house with the big porch. After Marcus left, Rose settled back into her chair with her coffee, regarding Emma with knowing eyes. He's a good man. Been through a lot, but he's got a kind heart. What happened to his wife? Emma asked, surprising herself with the question. Car accident about 3 years ago. Sarah was struggling with depression after Lucy was born postpartum, and she'd been having a hard time. The accident happened on a night when she'd been particularly low. Rose's expression grew sad. Marcus blames himself, thinks he should have seen it coming, should have done more to help her. Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December weather. What kind of car accident? Brake failure, they said. She was driving down Miller's Hill during a snowstorm, and when she tried to stop at the intersection, nothing happened. Went straight into that big oak tree at the bottom of the hill. Rose shook her head. Terrible thing. Sarah was driving one of those new sedans, a Sterling something or other. Marcus always said it was strange because he just had the brakes checked the week before. Emma's coffee cup slipped from her nerveless fingers, shattering against the kitchen floor as the pieces of a horrible puzzle clicked into place in her mind. Sarah Kane had been driving a Sterling Pembroke Series sedan. The brake failure that had killed her wasn't an accident. It was the very defect that Elena had died trying to expose. Marcus Kane's wife had been murdered by Emma's own family's negligence, and Emma was falling in love with the man who had every right to hate everything the Sterling name represented. Dr. James Chen's office occupied the second floor of a converted Victorian house on Maple Street, its windows overlooking the snow-covered park where children played and couples walked hand in hand on weekend afternoons. James had chosen the location deliberately. He believed that healing happened best in spaces that felt more like homes than institutions. This morning, however, the peaceful view outside did little to calm the unease that had been growing in his mind since his encounter with Emma Novak. He'd spent 20 years learning to read people, to identify the subtle signs of trauma and distress, and everything about Emma suggested someone carrying a burden far heavier than simple heartbreak or career dissatisfaction. The knock on his office door interrupted his thoughts. Come in. Marcus appeared in the doorway, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. Do you have a few minutes? I know I don't have an appointment, but... Of course, James gestured to the comfortable chair across from his desk. What's on your mind? Marcus settled into the chair, running a hand through his hair in a gesture James recognized as one of his friend's anxiety tells. It's about Emma, Emma Novak. James leaned back slightly, his professional interest sharpening. What about her? I invited her to dinner tonight. Lucy's idea mostly, but Marcus paused, struggling to find the right words. James, I haven't felt anything like this since Sarah died. Hell, maybe not even then. There's something about Emma that makes me want to know everything about her, but she's so guarded, so careful. I can't shake the feeling that she's hiding something significant. What kind of something? Marcus shook his head, frustrated. I don't know. But there are things that don't add up. Her clothes are expensive, but she acts like she's broke. She pays in cash, always exact amounts, like she's used to not leaving paper trails. And yesterday when I mentioned that Lucy goes to Millbrook Elementary, she got this look on her face like she was calculating something. James made a note in his pad, thinking about his own observations of Emma. How do you feel about not knowing? Terrified, Marcus admitted. Because part of me doesn't care what she's hiding. Part of me just wants to trust that whatever brought her here, she's a good person who deserves a chance at happiness. But the other part, the part that's responsible for Lucy, that part thinks I'm being naive. And which part do you think is right? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the park, where a young mother was pushing her child on the swings. I think they both are. I think Emma is a good person, and I think she's hiding something that could change everything. James set down his pen regarding his friend with careful attention. In all the time he'd known Marcus, he'd never seen him this conflicted about anything. The man was decisive by nature, a quality that had served him well as both a mechanic and a single father. This uncertainty was new territory. What does Lucy think of her? A smile ghosted across Marcus's face. Lucy likes her. Really likes her. She's been drawing pictures of the three of us together, talking about teaching Emma how to make her famous chocolate chip cookies. Yesterday, she asked me if I thought Emma was lonely. And what did you tell her? The truth. That I thought Emma was probably one of the loneliest people I'd ever met. James made another note, pieces of a psychological profile beginning to form in his mind. Wealth that was being hidden, a tendency toward isolation, the kind of wariness that suggested someone who'd been betrayed or threatened. Add to that the way Emma had reacted to learning he was a psychologist, not curiosity or interest, but a careful measuring as if she was assessing whether he posed a threat. Marcus, can I ask you a favor? Of course. Tonight, when Emma comes to dinner, pay attention to the details. How she reacts to certain topics, whether she seems familiar with things she shouldn't know about, if she has any physical tells that suggest stress or deception. James paused, choosing his words carefully. I'm not suggesting you interrogate her. Just observe. Marcus nodded slowly. You think she's dangerous? No, James said immediately, but I think she's in danger. And if that's the case, you and Lucy could be walking into something complicated. After Marcus left, James sat alone in his office, staring out at the peaceful streets of Millbrook and thinking about the different kinds of trauma he'd encountered in his practice. There was the obvious kind, the grief of losing a spouse, the anxiety that followed accidents or abuse. But there was also the more insidious trauma that came from being hunted, from carrying secrets too dangerous to share, from loving someone you knew you'd eventually have to leave behind. Emma Novak, he was becoming increasingly certain, was carrying all three. The Kane house at 6 o'clock was a symphony of domestic chaos. Lucy had insisted on setting the table with Sarah's good china, which Marcus had protested was unnecessary for a casual dinner. The result was a compromise, everyday plates with the fancy cloth napkins, mismatched glasses that Lucy had arranged with the artistic flair of a 9-year-old who took entertaining very seriously. Emma arrived precisely on time, carrying a bottle of wine that she'd driven to the next town over to purchase, not wanting to risk running into anyone she might have met in Millbrook. She stood on the front porch for a moment before knocking, listening to the sounds of laughter and conversation drifting through the windows, steeling herself for an evening that felt both necessary and dangerous. Marcus opened the door and Emma felt her breath catch slightly at the sight of him. He'd cleaned up for dinner, dark jeans and a button-down shirt that brought out the blue in his eyes, and the smile he gave her was warm enough to make her forget momentarily all the reasons she shouldn't be here. "You found us," he said, stepping back to let her in. "Your directions were perfect." Emma handed him the wine, taking in the cozy interior of the house. It was unmistakably a home where a child lived, artwork on the refrigerator, toys in organized chaos on a bookshelf, the kind of gentle disorder that spoke of love and attention rather than neglect. Lucy appeared from the kitchen wearing an apron that was too big for her and a proud expression that suggested she'd been heavily involved in dinner preparation. "Alma, I helped make the sauce from scratch. Well, mostly from a jar, but we added extra herbs." Emma felt something tight in her chest loosen at Lucy's enthusiasm. "It smells wonderful." The dinner that followed was unlike anything Emma had experienced in years. At Sterling, family dinner's conversation had been formal, strategic discussions of market share and quarterly projections punctuated by carefully neutral observations about weather or current events. Here, Lucy chattered about her science project, Marcus shared stories about his more interesting car repair challenges, and Emma found herself laughing genuinely for the first time in months. "So what do you do for work?" Lucy asked over dessert store-bought ice cream that she'd insisted on serving in Sarah's crystal bowls. Emma felt Marcus's attention sharpen slightly, and she chose her words carefully. "I used to work in business, corporate consulting, but I'm taking some time off to figure out what I want to do next." "That sounds smart," Lucy said matter-of-factly. "Dr. Chen says it's important to listen to your heart, not just your brain when you're making big decisions." Marcus caught Emma's eye across the table, and she saw the understanding there. He recognized the careful way she'd answered without really answering at all. But instead of pressing, he simply nodded and changed the subject to Lucy's upcoming Christmas concert. Later, as Emma helped with the dishes, despite Marcus's protests, Lucy disappeared upstairs to work on homework, leaving the two adults alone in the kitchen. The easy conversation of dinner continued, but underneath it, Emma could feel something building, a tension that had nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with truth. "You're very good with her," Emma said, drying a plate with careful attention. "She's easy to be good with, smart, funny, resilient." Marcus's voice carried the deep affection of a devoted father. "She's been through a lot, but she's handling it better than I am most days." Emma set the plate down, turning to face him. "What happened to her mother, if you don't mind me asking?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, his hands still in the soapy water. "Car accident, 3 years ago. Sarah had been struggling with depression, and I thought we were managing it, but..." He shrugged the gesture, carrying years of guilt and regret. "She was driving home from her therapy appointment, and her brakes failed. The car went straight into a tree." Emma felt the room spin slightly around her. "Brake failure. Yeah, the weird thing was, I just had them checked the week before. The mechanic said they were fine." Marcus pulled his hands from the water, reaching for a towel. Sarah was driving a Sterling Pembroke Series sedan. Beautiful car, supposed to be one of the safest vehicles on the market. But something went wrong that night. Emma gripped the edge of the counter, fighting to keep her expression neutral, even as her world collapsed around her. She was standing in the kitchen of a man whose wife had died because of her family's greed, listening to him describe the very cover-up that had cost Elena her life. "I'm sorry," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus looked at her sharply, something in her tone catching his attention. "Emma, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." She had. She'd seen the ghost of every decision that had led her to this moment, Elena's investigation. The cover-up, the plane crash, her own cowardly flight from responsibility. And now she was falling in love with a man who had every right to hate her family's name, whose daughter was drawing pictures that included Emma as part of their future. "I'm fine," Emma lied, forcing a smile that felt like glass. "Just tired. It's been a long day." Marcus studied her for a moment longer, and Emma saw the exact instant when he decided not to push. It was a kindness she didn't deserve, this gentle respect for her boundaries, and it made everything so much worse. "Let me drive you back to Rose's," he offered. "No, I can walk. It's not far, and the fresh air will do me good." They said their goodbyes at the front door, Lucy appearing long enough to extract a promise from Emma to come back soon. As Emma walked through the snow-covered streets of Millbrook, she felt the weight of impossible choices settling around her like a shroud. She could stay and build something real with Marcus and Lucy, but only by living a lie that would eventually destroy them all. Or she could leave, disappearing back into the shadows and safety of anonymity, but abandoning the first genuine happiness she'd found in years. There was a third option, of course, to telling Marcus the truth about who she was and what she knew about Sarah's death. But that would mean exposing Elena's evidence, putting herself in the crosshairs of the people who'd killed her sister, and quite possibly losing Marcus anyway once he learned that she was a Sterling. Emma let herself into Rose's house, quietly slipping upstairs to her room where she sat on the bed and stared at her reflection in the darkened window. The woman looking back at her was a stranger, someone who'd learned to care more about protecting her own heart than seeking justice for the dead. But as she thought about Lucy's bright smile and Marcus's gentle hands and the way they'd both welcomed her into their lives without question, Emma realized that some choices were too important to be made alone. Tomorrow she would call the one person who might be able to help her find a way forward that didn't require sacrificing everything she'd found in Millbrook. Tomorrow she would start the process of becoming brave enough to choose love over safety. Tonight she would mourn the woman she'd been before she'd learned that courage and terror could exist in the same heart. The phone call came at 3 in the morning, piercing through Emma's restless sleep like a blade. She'd been dreaming about brake lights that wouldn't respond and a tree looming larger in a windshield, Sarah Kane's face replacing Elena's in the moment before impact. Emma. The voice was familiar, professional, and carried an undertone of urgency that made her blood run cold. It's David Morrison. David had been Elena's personal attorney, one of the few people who'd known about her investigation into Sterling Automotive's cover-ups. Emma sat up in bed, immediately alert despite the hour. David, how did you get this number? I've been tracking your movements through credit card usage and cell phone pings. You've been off the grid for weeks, but the call you made to my office yesterday triggered some alerts I'd set up. His voice was tight with stress. Emma, we need to talk. Now. Emma felt her mouth go dry. She'd called David's office the previous afternoon after her dinner with Marcus and Lucy, but had hung up before leaving a message. The weight of what she'd learned about Sarah Kane's death had made her desperate to speak with someone who understood the full scope of Elena's investigation. Is this line secure? As secure as anything can be. Listen, Emma, they know you're alive. The investigative team that was looking into Elena's death has been asking questions about you, and some very dangerous people are starting to realize that you might have access to the same information Elena died protecting. Emma's hand trembled as she gripped the phone. What kind of questions? About your whereabouts during the month before Elena's death. About whether Elena might have shared her findings with you. About whether you might have copies of the documents she'd gathered. David's voice dropped lower. Emma, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You're not safe where you are. The people who killed Elena won't hesitate to kill you too if they think you pose a threat. Through Rose's thin walls, Emma could hear the old house settling around her, the familiar creaks and sighs of a building that had sheltered 3 generations of Murphy family members. Outside, Millbrook slept peacefully, unaware that secrets and violence from the corporate world were creeping closer to their quiet mountain sanctuary. I can't run anymore, David, Emma said quietly. I found something here, something real. And there's more to this than just Elena's investigation. What do you mean? Emma took a deep breath, knowing that once she spoke the words aloud, there would be no taking them back. I've discovered that one of the vehicles affected by the brake defect Elena was investigating, a Sterling Pembroke series sedan, was involved in a fatal accident here in Millbrook 3 years ago. A woman named Sarah Kane died because our family's company prioritized profits over safety. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long that Emma wondered if the call had been disconnected. Finally, David spoke, his voice heavy with understanding. And you've gotten involved with her family? With her husband and daughter, yes. Emma closed her eyes, feeling tears she'd been holding back for hours finally begin to fall. David, I'm in love with Marcus Kane, and his daughter has been drawing pictures of the 3 of us together, talking about teaching me to make cookies and helping with her science projects. They've welcomed me into their lives without knowing that my family is responsible for destroying theirs. Jesus, Emma. David's professional composure cracked slightly. This complicates everything. If you expose Elena's evidence, now you'll be putting Marcus Kane's family directly in the spotlight of a federal investigation. They'll become targets just by association with you. Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, thinking about Lucy's bright smile and Marcus's gentle way of looking at her like she was someone worth protecting. What if I don't expose the evidence? What if I just disappear again? Then Elena died for nothing, and more people will die in vehicles that Sterling Automotive knows are defective. David's voice hardened. Emma, your sister sacrificed her life to expose this cover-up. You're the only person left who can finish what she started. And if I stay here without telling Marcus the truth, then you'll be living a lie that will eventually destroy any relationship you try to build with him. Secrets this big don't stay buried forever. Emma stared out her window at the snow-covered streets of Millbrook, thinking about the impossible choice David was laying out for her. Expose the truth and put Marcus and Lucy in danger, or abandon them to protect them, or stay and live a lie that would poison everything good between them. There's a fourth option, she said slowly, an idea beginning to form in her mind. What if I tell Marcus the truth of all of it and let him decide whether he wants to be part of this fight? That's incredibly risky, Emma. You'd be asking him to choose between justice for his wife and safety for his daughter. Maybe, or maybe I'd be giving him the chance to heal from his wife's death by helping to prevent other families from going through what he's experienced. Emma felt something settle in her chest, a calm certainty that surprised her. Marcus Kane is one of the strongest, most honorable men I've ever met. He deserves to know the truth, and he deserves the chance to decide what to do with it. David was quiet for a moment, and Emma could almost hear him weighing the legal and personal implications of what she was proposing. If you're going to do this, you need to be prepared for every possible outcome. Marcus might hate you. He might throw you out of his life and never speak to you again. I know. The people who killed Elena might come after him and Lucy if they think he's cooperating with any investigation. I know that too. And there's no guarantee that exposing this information will lead to justice. Corporate prosecutions are notoriously difficult, and the Sterling family has resources that most people can't imagine. Emma thought about Elena's face during their last lunch together, the determination in her green eyes, as she'd talked about doing the right thing regardless of the cost. Elena knew all of that too. She chose to fight anyway. Then you're really going to do this? Yes. The word came out stronger than Emma had expected, carrying a conviction that felt like coming home to herself after months of hiding. But I need you to help me do it right. I want to approach Marcus with a concrete plan, not just a confession and a promise. David sighed, but Emma could hear something like approval in his voice. All right, give me 48 hours to put together a comprehensive strategy, how to release Elena's evidence, how to protect witnesses, how to structure any cooperation with federal investigators. Can you keep yourself safe for 2 more days? Emma looked around Rose's spare bedroom, thinking about the elderly woman downstairs who'd offered her sanctuary without asking questions about Lucy's trusting smile and Marcus's gentle hands fixing things that were broken. I can do 2 more days. After she hung up, Emma sat in the darkness for a long time listening to the quiet sounds of Millbrook, settling into the deep hours of night. In 48 hours, she would either have found a way to build a future based on truth and justice, or she would have lost everything that mattered to her. But for the first time since Elena's death, Emma felt like herself again, not Elena Sterling's shadow, or Emma Novak's carefully constructed fiction, but the woman Elena had raised her to be someone brave enough to choose what was right over what was easy. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of mountain sunshine that made even December snow look like scattered diamonds. Marcus arrived at the garage early as always, but found himself unable to concentrate on the usual rhythm of work. Emma's face kept appearing in his mind, the way she'd looked during dinner laughing at Lucy's stories, and then later standing in his kitchen with an expression he couldn't quite read. James arrived just after 9, carrying coffee and the knowing look of someone who'd been expecting this conversation. Rough night, James asked, settling onto his usual stool. Marcus looked up from the engine he had been staring at without really seeing. How can you tell? You've been holding that same wrench for 10 minutes without moving it, and you look like a man wrestling with something bigger than a carburetor problem. Marcus set the wrench down, accepting the coffee James offered. It's Emma. There's something about her that doesn't add up, and I can't decide if I'm being paranoid or naive. Tell me what you observed last night. Marcus thought back to dinner, mentally cataloging the details that had caught his attention. She knew things she shouldn't have known. When Lucy mentioned her science project about volcanic eruptions, Emma started explaining the chemical process behind them in terms that suggested real education, not just casual knowledge. And when I mentioned Sarah's car accident, she went white as a sheet, not sympathy pale, but shock pale. James had made a note in his ever-present pad. What else? Her wine. Marcus rubbed his forehead, feeling foolish for noticing such a small detail. She brought a bottle of Cabernet that cost at least $60. I know because I looked it up after she left. That's more than most people in Millbrook spend on groceries for a week. But she's staying with Rose Murphy and driving a 10-year-old Honda. Exactly. And she paid cash for her car repair, exact change, like she's used to not leaving paper trails. Marcus met James's eyes. I'm falling for someone I don't really know anything about, and that scares the hell out of me. James was quiet for a moment, weighing his words carefully. Marcus, can I share something with you that's not quite a professional confidence, but isn't entirely public knowledge either? Marcus nodded, intrigued by his friend's careful phrasing. Yesterday, Lucy came to the library and asked Mrs. Patterson to help her research Emma Novak. What she found was interesting. Marcus felt his stomach drop. What kind of interesting? The kind where Emma's photo appears in search results for Elena Sterling, the CEO of Sterling Automotive, who was supposedly killed in a plane crash 6 months ago. The wrench Marcus had been holding clattered to the floor, the sound echoing through the garage like a gunshot. Sterling Automotive, the company that made Sarah's car. The same. James leaned forward, his expression serious. Marcus, I think Emma, or whoever she really is, might be connected to the very company whose vehicle killed your wife. Marcus felt the ground shifting beneath him. Everything he thought he knew about Emma rearranging itself into a pattern that was both terrifying and heartbreaking. The careful way she'd reacted when he'd mentioned Sarah's accident, the expensive taste she was trying to hide, the way she'd looked at him like she was memorizing his face. Do you think she came here on purpose, looking for me? I don't know, but I think there's more to this story than just a woman running from corporate pressure. James hesitated, then continued. Marcus, if Emma really is Elena Sterling, then she's not just hiding from paparazzi or boardroom politics. She's hiding from people who might want her dead. Marcus stared at his friend, processing the implications. And I invited her into my home, around Lucy, which might have been exactly what she needed, James said gently. Sometimes the people running from the most dangerous situations are the ones who need sanctuary the most. Before Marcus could respond, the garage door opened and Emma stepped inside, bringing with her the scent of cold air and the carefully controlled composure he was beginning to recognize as her armor against the world. She wore the same practical clothes as always, but now Marcus could see past the disguise to the quality beneath the perfect cut of her jeans, the cashmere blend of her sweater, the subtle signs of wealth that she'd tried so hard to hide. Good morning, she said, her gaze moving between Marcus and James with an uncertainty that suggested she could feel the tension in the room. Emma. Marcus straightened, studying her face with new eyes. We need to talk. Something flickered across her expression, resignation perhaps, or relief. Yes, we do. James stood, recognizing the moment for what it was. I'll leave you two alone. No, Emma said quickly, then caught herself. I mean, if Marcus doesn't mind, I'd like you to stay. What I have to tell him, it might be helpful to have a professional perspective. Marcus nodded and James settled back onto his stool, his psychologist training kicking in, as he prepared to help navigate what was clearly going to be a difficult conversation. Emma moved to the center of the garage, her hands clasped in front of her, like someone preparing to make a confession that could change everything. In the morning light filtering through the windows, Marcus could see the exhaustion. She carried the weight of secrets that had carved lines around her eyes and tension into her shoulders. My name isn't Emma Novak. She began, her voice steady, despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. My name is Emma Sterling. Elena Sterling was my twin sister. Marcus felt the words hit him like a physical blow, but he remained silent, giving her space to continue. Elena died 6 months ago when her private jet crashed into Lake Superior. But her death wasn't an accident, it was murder. She'd discovered evidence of a massive cover-up at Sterling Automotive, a systematic effort to hide safety defects in our vehicles that had already killed dozens of people. Emma's voice caught slightly, but she pushed forward. Marcus, one of those vehicles was a Sterling Pembroke Series sedan. The brake defect Elena was investigating, the one that got her killed, is the same defect that caused Sarah's accident. The garage fell silent except for the soft hum of the space heater and the distant sound of traffic on Main Street. Marcus stared at Emma, processing the enormity of what she just revealed, feeling the careful structure of his world reshaping itself around this new reality. "You knew," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "When I told you about the brake failure, you knew exactly what had happened." Emma nodded, tears beginning to track down her cheeks. "Yes. And I knew that staying here getting close to you and Lucy was the most selfish thing I could possibly do, but I couldn't make myself leave." Marcus looked at this woman he'd been falling in love with, seeing her clearly for the first time. Not Emma Novak, the mysterious stranger who'd appeared in his life like a gift, but Emma Sterling, heir to an automotive empire, sister to a murdered whistleblower, keeper of secrets that could bring down corporations and cost lives. "Why are you telling me this now?" Emma met his eyes, and Marcus saw in them the same courage that had drawn him to her from the beginning, not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. "Because Elena died trying to expose the truth about what our family's company had done, because Sarah deserved better than to die for someone else's greed. And because I love you and Lucy too much to build our future on a lie." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and danger. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, the anger and betrayal he'd expected to feel replaced by something more complex: grief for Sarah. Yes, but also admiration for Emma's courage and a growing understanding that she was offering him something he'd never expected to find: the chance to turn his wife's death into something meaningful. The opportunity to fight for justice, not just for Sarah, but for all the families who'd lost loved ones to corporate negligence. The chance to choose love that was built on truth, no matter how dangerous that truth might be. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Marcus said finally. Emma took a shaky breath, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same determination Marcus had heard in Elena's recorded statements during the congressional hearings about automotive safety. "I'm asking you to help me finish what Elena started, to expose Sterling Automotive's cover-up and make sure that no other family has to go through what you and Lucy have endured. And I'm asking you to trust that whatever happens next, we'll face it together." Marcus looked at this woman who'd appeared in his life like a secret that had finally found the courage to reveal itself. Emma Sterling, who could have chosen safety and silence, but had instead chosen love and justice. Lucy had been right, he realized. Sometimes the most important thing you could do was leave the door unlocked, even when it looked closed. And sometimes the people who needed sanctuary most were the ones brave enough to fight for others, even when it meant risking everything they'd found worth protecting. "Tell me everything," Marcus said, stepping closer to Emma, close enough to take her hands in his. "Tell me about Elena's investigation, about the evidence you have, about the people who killed your sister. Tell me what we're up against, and then we'll figure out how to fight them." Emma's smile through her tears was the most beautiful thing Marcus had ever seen. Not the careful, guarded expression she'd worn as Emma Novak, but the radiant hope of someone who'd finally found a partner brave enough to stand with her in the light. "We'll need help," she said, "and it's going to be dangerous. The people who killed Elena won't hesitate to come after us if they think we're a threat." Marcus nodded, thinking about Lucy and the future they were all fighting for. "Then we better make sure we're ready for them." And as James watched from his perch on the stool, he saw something he'd rarely witnessed in his years of practice: two broken people choosing to heal together, their love strong enough to transform pain into purpose and secrets into strength. The fight ahead would be difficult, dangerous, and uncertain. But they would face it as a family bound together not by blood or convenience, but by the conscious choice to build something beautiful from the wreckage of their separate griefs. It was, James thought, the most hopeful thing he'd seen in years. 2 weeks later, the federal courthouse in Denver was a monument to justice and bureaucracy, its stone facade rising against the Colorado sky like a promise that truth would eventually prevail. Emma stood on the steps, flanked by Marcus and David Morrison, watching as reporters gathered for what would become one of the most significant corporate whistleblower cases in automotive history. The night before, Marcus had stood in Lucy's doorway, watching her sleep, knowing that tomorrow would change everything. They'd agreed the courthouse was no place for a 9-year-old, but leaving her felt like abandoning a post he'd sworn to never leave unguarded. The image that haunted him wasn't of corporate executives or courtroom drama. It was of Lucy walking home from school to find strangers with cameras waiting on their front porch. "Are you ready for this?" David asked, adjusting his tie in the way Emma recognized as his pre-battle ritual. Emma looked at Marcus, whose hand was steady and warm in hers, despite the tension she could feel radiating from his shoulders. Over the past 2 weeks, they'd worked together to organize Elena's evidence coordinate with federal investigators and prepare for the media storm that would inevitably follow. The hardest conversation hadn't been with lawyers or FBI agents. It had been the night Marcus sat Lucy down and explained that some people might say unkind things about their family, that protecting the truth sometimes meant accepting that the world would become less safe. "I'm ready," Emma said, squeezing Marcus's hand. "But are we?" Marcus met her eyes, and she saw there the same fierce protectiveness that had drawn her to him from the beginning. Not just love, but the quiet strength of a man who'd learned that some fights were worth whatever they cost. "We are," he said simply. Inside the courthouse, Emma took her place at the witness table, looking out at a room filled with lawyers, journalists, sterling automotive executives, and families who'd lost loved ones to defective vehicles. In the front row, she could see Margaret Chen, Sarah Kane's sister, who'd flown in from California to hear Emma's testimony. Behind her sat faces that Emma recognized from the victim impact statements, parents, spouses, children, who'd inherited grief instead of justice. "State your name for the record," the prosecutor said. "Emma Margaret Sterling. And what is your relationship to Sterling Automotive?" Emma took a breath, feeling the weight of Elena's sacrifice and Marcus's faith and Lucy's trust settling around her like armor. "I am the twin sister of Elena Sterling, former CEO of Sterling Automotive, and I am here to present evidence that my sister died trying to expose." For the next 4 hours, Emma laid out the systematic cover-up that had cost Sarah Kane her life and dozens of other innocent people theirs. She presented internal memos, test results, and recorded conversations that painted a clear picture of corporate negligence and deliberate deception. When she finished, the courtroom was silent, except for the soft sound of someone crying in the back row and the distant scratch of reporters' pens capturing every word. "Thank you, Ms. Sterling," the judge said. "This court will recess while we review the evidence you've presented." Outside the courthouse, Emma found Marcus waiting for her on the steps, his phone pressed to his ear, his expression sharp with concern. "Everything okay at the school?" he was saying. "No, don't let anyone through the front office without checking with me first. I don't care if they say they're from the district." He hung up and turned to Emma, his face softening. "Rose says there were 3 cars with out-of-state plates parked outside Millbrook Elementary this morning. Probably reporters, but you can't be sure," Emma finished, understanding flooding through her. This was the price of truth, not just her own safety, but the ripple effects that would touch everyone she loved. "How do you feel?" Marcus asked, pulling her into his arms despite the cameras clicking around them. Emma looked up at the man who'd chosen to stand with her despite everything, thinking about Elena and Sarah and all the families who might be protected by what they had accomplished today. But she also thought about Lucy probably sitting in Rose's kitchen right now, drawing pictures while strangers decided whether her family's story was worth the headlines. "I feel like we've started something we can't control," she said honestly. "And I feel like we did it anyway because someone had to." Marcus nodded, his hand finding hers. "Then we'd better get home. Lucy's making us dinner tonight. She wants to celebrate even if she doesn't fully understand what we're celebrating." As they walked down the courthouse steps together, hand in hand, Emma Sterling, no longer hiding, no longer running, no longer carrying her secrets alone, felt the weight of the past lifting from her shoulders. But it was replaced not by the bright promise of simple happiness, but by something more complex, the understanding that justice was a living thing, something that required tending protection, vigilance. Behind them, the wheels of justice began to turn slowly but inevitably towards something that might be light. And ahead of them, a little girl waited in a kitchen in Millbrook, trusting that the adults in her life would find a way to keep her safe in a world that had suddenly become much larger and less predictable than before. The fight, Emma realized, was just beginning. But at least now they weren't fighting it alone. The snow had begun to fall again over Millbrook, each flake catching the amber glow of streetlights like whispered promises. Emma stood at the kitchen window, watching Lucy build a snowman in the yard, while Marcus adjusted the porch light, the same light that had guided her to their door that first December evening. In her pocket, she carried Elena's wedding ring returned to her after the trial. Not as a burden now, but as a reminder that some fights were worth the cost. The corporate executives had been sentenced, the recall issued, the families compensated. But those were just words in newspapers, verdicts in courtrooms. This was different. This was Lucy's laughter echoing through rooms that had been too quiet for too long. This was Marcus's hands finding hers in the darkness, no longer afraid of what secrets morning might bring. This was the weight of truth shared rather than carried alone. Elena would never see this kitchen, would never know how her courage had grown into something larger than justice. But perhaps that was enough, love taking root in the places where truth had been planted, blooming in seasons she would never witness. The future remained unwritten, uncertain as tomorrow's weather. But they would face it together, carrying forward not the weight of what was lost, but the grace of what was found.